First, a disclaimer. Because I have the title Astronomer Royal, I'm sometimes asked, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? I respond, I've never been asked. I'm not an astrologer. I've got no crystal ball. Indeed, scientists are rather poor forecasters, though not as bad as economists. So my predictions this evening will be very tentative, and they will indeed draw on my recent book, where I offer a mix of scientific optimism and political pessimism. My book's theme is this: the Earth's existed for 45 million centuries, but this century is special. It's the first when the main threats come from one species, ours, and not from nature. And we've had one lucky escape already. At any time in the Cold War, the superpowers could have stumbled towards Armageddon through muddle or miscalculation. Nuclear weapons are based on 20th century science, and I'll focus later in my talk on 21st century science, bio, cyber, and AI, which offer huge benefits, but also create novel vulnerabilities. But even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are some things that we can predict. For instance, humanity's collective footprint is getting heavier. 50 years ago, world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.6 billion. The number of births per year is actually going down in most countries now. Nonetheless, the world's population is forecast to rise to around 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because most people in the developing world are young, they're yet to have children, and they will live longer. The age histogram in the developing world will become more like it is in Europe, as many old people as young people. Moreover, the demographic transition hasn't yet occurred in Africa. Population growth is rather under-discussed. That's partly perhaps because of associations with eugenics in the 1920s and 30s, with Mrs. Gandhi's policy, and with China's one-child policy. But also because of doom-laden forecasts in the late 60s by, for instance, the Club of Rome, which proved off the mark. As it's turned out, there was no mass starvation, and food production has kept pace with rising populations. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not to overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion people will require further improved agriculture, and maybe some dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food, and eating artificial meat and not beef. To quote Gandhi, enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Demographics beyond 2050 are uncertain. It's not even clear whether there will be a continuing rise or whether the population will start to fall. Declining infant mortality, urbanization, and women's education, of course, trigger the transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. For instance, if for whatever reason families in Africa remain large, then that continent's population will double again by 2100 to 4 billion. Nigeria would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings also 2 hands and a brain. But the geopolitical stresses of this scenario are surely worrying. Those in poor countries now know via the internet, etc., the injustice of their fate. And migration's easier. Moreover, the advent of robots and reshoring of manufacturing means that still poor countries won't be able to grow their economies by offering cheap skilled labor, as the Asian tigers did, because robots do that. And this is a portent for disaffection and instability. So surely wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote prosperity in Africa and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could cause mass extinctions. We'd be destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is a crucial component of human well-being. We're clearly harmed if fish stocks dwindle to extinction. There are plants in the rainforest whose gene pool might be useful. And insects are crucial for the food chain and fertilization. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. Moreover, these pressures are aggravated by climate change, something that is not under-discussed, though still under-acted upon. Under business-as-usual scenarios, we can't rule out, later in the century, really catastrophic warming, and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice. But even those who accept these IPCC scenarios have diverse views on the policy response, and I want to expand a bit on this. The Danish campaigner Born Lomborg has sort of bogeyman status among environmentalists, somewhat unfairly, as he doesn't contest the science. But his Copenhagen consensus of eminent economists downplays the priority of addressing climate change compared with shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. And that's because he applies a standard discount, 5% per year, something like that, which in effect writes off what happens after 2050. But if you care about those who will live into the 22nd century and beyond, then, as other economists like Stern and Weitzman argue, you deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect that generation against worst-case scenarios. The case for urgent action to address climate change is surely compelling. But, as John Major said so eloquently this morning, politicians won't gain much resonance by advocating sacrifices now when the benefits mainly accrue to distant parts of the world decades in the future. Unless there's a clamour from voters, governments won't properly prioritise these crucial long-term measures. And sustaining this clamour needs effective campaigning and enlisting charismatic individuals to change the public mindset. Let me give two examples. The papal encyclical Laudato Si eased the path to consensus at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. The Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and he has 1 billion followers in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia. And more parochially, I doubt that Michael Gove would have become exercised about non-degradable waste had it not been for the BBC's Blue Planet programmes, fronted by our secular Pope David Attenborough, especially the image of an albatross returning from its nest and regurgitating plastic debris, as iconic as the polar bear on its melting ice floe for climate campaigners. And it's encouraging to witness more activists among the young. They hope to live to the end of a century. Their campaigning is welcome. Their commitment gives ground for hope. Incidentally, there's one win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations should expand research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation. They should spend as much on this as on defense research, and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial: storage, batteries, hydrogen, pump storage, etc., and smart grids, eventually to span the world, maybe on the Belt and Road all the way from China to Europe. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so that they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generating capacity is needed, and where the health of the poor is now jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood and dung, and where there would otherwise be pressure to build coal-fired power stations if they're the cheapest. It would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising economical clean energy systems for the world. And this country can have a leverage by spearheading this. We generate less than 2% of the world's CO2, but I think we generate much more than 2% of the world's clever ideas. We should be evangelists for new technology, not Luddites. Without it, the world can't provide clean energy for an expanding and more demanding population, nor enough food, nor better health. But technology must be wisely directed. Indeed, many of us are anxious that bio, cyber, and robotics are advancing so unpredictably that we may not properly cope, and that we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. Microbiology offers prospects of containing pandemics and enhancing health and food production. But these same advances strengthen concerns about the safety of experiments and the dissemination of dangerous knowledge. For instance, in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make the flu virus both more virulent and more transmissible. And new gene editing techniques are hugely promising, but there are already ethical concerns, for instance, about the Chinese experiments modifying human embryos. And there's anxiety about possible runaway consequences of gene drive programs to wipe out species as diverse as mosquitoes or grey squirrels. If it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. Governments are rightly adopting a stringent and precautionary attitude to biotech. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. Whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without conspicuous special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale, dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning as a student hobby. And the global village will have its village idiots, but their actions can now cascade globally. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups by biotech will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. It's a wise maxim that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And in cybertech, the arms race between hackers and defenders will become more expensive and vexatious. And that's in particular a downside of advancing AI. So a few more words about AI. It's of course the speed of computers which allows them to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. EU documents, for instance, their boredom threshold's infinite. And the DeepMind company, just down the road from here, has shown that if the computer is given the rules of a game like chess or Go, it only takes a few hours before it's learnt enough by playing thousands of games against itself to beat the world champion. AI can cope better than humans with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flow, or electric grids. The Chinese could run an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of. Machines will, in the short term, take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution in this country and others. They can also supplement or even replace many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, even surgery. In contrast, some non-routine service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, will be among the hardest to automate. The digital revolution generates enormous wealth for innovators and global companies. But preserving a healthy society will surely require redistribution of that wealth. I'd argue it should be redeployed to create huge numbers of upgraded jobs where human empathy is crucial. We want, for instance, a real carer when we're old or sick. We want children to be taught and told stories by real people, not automata. Such jobs are shamefully scarce and underappreciated today. But if the political will were there, such jobs could provide fulfilling employment for all those who will lose horrible jobs in call centers or Amazon warehouses. AI will become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud. The data may be used for benign purposes, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we would expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If these decisions are entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. And there'll be other privacy concerns. Are you happy if facial recognition allows the government, a conglomerate, or even a random stranger to identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake evidence becomes so convincing that videos can no longer be trusted? Society will surely be transformed by autonomous robots and AI. But looking further ahead, the jury's out on whether robots will ever manifest human capabilities or common sense. They can't learn by watching real humans, because to them, watching us is as slow as watching trees grow is for us, because their times go so fast. Some people think that we should worry less about artificial intelligence than about real stupidity for a long time. In contrast, there are gung-ho enthusiasts like the futurologist Ray Kurzweil. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines. He predicts that humans will transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they will go over to the other side. But Kurzweil's worried that this nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he signed up with a company in Arizona that'll freeze and store your body, so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I was surprised to find that 3 academic colleagues here in England had gone in for this, Cryonics. 2 paid the full whack, the 3rd cut price for just having his head frozen. I was glad they were all from Oxford, not from my university. And I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. Kurzweil's vision may be science fiction, but it's surely credible that human lifetimes could be extended a bit, and that our mentality and physique will become malleable via genetic and cyborg technologies. And this secular intelligent design will change us far faster than Darwinian evolution did. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilization. Human nature hasn't changed for millennia. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. And now I turn very briefly to my favorite technology, space. This is where robots surely have a future and where change will happen fastest and should worry us less. We depend on space every day for sat-nav, communications, weather forecasting, etc. Cheap microsatellites open up new commercial markets. Swarms of tiny probes will explore the solar system. And the next step will be deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures under zero gravity. For instance, solar energy collectors or giant radio antennae. But what about manned spaceflight? Its greatest achievement, the Apollo moon landings, seem ancient history to today's young people. The practical case for sending people gets ever weaker with each advance in robots and miniaturization. So were I an American, I wouldn't support NASA's manned program. I'd argue that private enterprise ventures like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin should front all manned missions. They can take higher risks than a Western country can impose on publicly funded civilians. There'll be many adventurous volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets. And this should be called space adventure, not space tourism. And I think that by 2100, courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth. Elon Musk himself says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. Here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. I think it's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Nowhere in our solar system is even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. But these pioneer adventurers who escape the Earth could be cosmically important. This is why. They'd be ill-adapted to a Martian environment, and they'll use all the resources of genetic and cyborg technology to adapt. They'd be beyond the clutches of our regulators. And they could, within a few generations, become a new species. And it's these pioneers, not those of us comfortably adapted on Earth, who will spearhead a kind of post-human evolution, far beyond the Earth. And they'll have plenty of time. It's taken us 4 billion years to evolve, but the universe may expand forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So there's abundant time for humanity's progeny to spread through the galaxy and beyond. This, of course, prompts the most common question astronomers are asked: is there life out there already? Or is the cosmos waiting for our progeny? We don't know. That's a topic for another lecture. But just one point I should say, that there are people who think they do know. I get letters from people who've been abducted or something like that, and they've met the aliens, and I say, would the aliens really come to the Earth, make all that effort, meet a couple of well-known cranks, and then go away again having made a corn circle? Seems unlikely. And I tell these people to write to each other and not to me. Yeah. So let me conclude more seriously by focusing back closer to the here and now. We are deep in what's called the Anthropocene. The stakes are higher than ever. Huge potential, huge risks. Our society, with a growing and more demanding population, is brittle, interconnected, and vulnerable. Scientists owe it to their fellow citizens to maximize the societal benefits of their discoveries and minimize the downsides. Science is universal culture, spanning all faiths and political divides. And of course, most of the challenges I've addressed are global. Coping with potential shortages of food, water resources, etc., and transitioning to low-carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can threat reduction. Indeed, as we've heard today, a key issue is whether we need more supranational organizations along the lines of the WHO and the International Atomic Energy Authority, not least to monitor and restrain ever more dominant global companies. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. We need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. And I give the last word to one of my scientific heroes, the eloquent biologist Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They're attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they don't make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for what was, I think, a tour de horizon look at our world and our planet as it's hurtling through the void, as you say. So before we begin talking about the future of humanity and the warning bells that you're ringing, not the cowbells, could I ask you to say just a few words about why a theoretical astrophysicist at the top of his academic game, when we first met, it was in the late 80s, I think, and we started working on the test ban together, the nuclear test ban, I should say. So for decades now, you've worked, in addition to your academic astrophysics work, you've worked on trying to make this world safer. You've written about the future of the planet in terms of war, climate change, artificial intelligence, biothreats, etc. So could you just say a few words of what took you there? Because not everybody goes down that route in academia.
Well, I was politically engaged even as a student. I was old enough to remember campaigning at the time of the Cuba crisis and later. And as you know, I got involved in pugwash-type activities in the 1980s. But in my later career, I had the opportunity to learn more because I became president of the Royal Society, I became a member of the House of Lords, and was involved in a lot of international activities, which gave me the chance to meet people and inform myself, at least in a superficial way, about these other subjects. And that's led me to devote at least a fraction of my time to these broader agendas.
And what advice would you give the young people in this room and those watching online later in terms of their careers and how they can combine what they do now with a more social, politically active approach to the planet?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously they should be politically active and campaign, but in terms of their career choice, clearly some careers are, in the words of Adair Turner, socially useless, whereas other careers are hugely beneficial. I would emphasize, as I did just now, that we need, for instance, better medicines, and we need better clean energy. This is something which should be an inspiration. And incidentally, I should have emphasized that when I use the word science, I really meant engineers as well. And they are more important. In fact, I don't know if there are any engineers here, but if they do, they like an old cartoon which shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver says to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." And this, I'm afraid, reflects the balance of effort between the scientists who just have a vague idea and the engineers who build something which meets a public need and actually works. And we need young people to be inspired to help to make the world more prosperous with clean energy in particular.
And would you recommend somebody who's a scientist also getting politically involved? Would you recommend people who are perhaps working in the city or in banking also to get politically involved? Is it something that's fulfilling? Is it something where, at the end of your life you can look back and say, I'm really glad I did that?
I think everyone has an obligation to be engaged, to be a concerned citizen, but I think it's easier for those who are academics or entrepreneurs. They have more independence than someone who works with a large company or within the government. So I think academics and entrepreneurs are those who probably have a deeper obligation.
Thank you. So going back to your talk, there's something been puzzling me about the way we behave as a species. So many of us have children. We give birth to them, we think a lot about the birth, we look after them, we feed them, we nourish them, we make sure they have the best food, organic if we can afford it. We put little helmets on them when they're going on their bikes. We send them off to the best schools we can possibly manage, the best universities. We worry so much about their happiness in life. But then, we're literally consuming and eating and wasting their resources for the future. We are creating a world for them and their children, which is going to be highly damaged by our activities. We're polluting it with plastics, with carbon. We're creating a situation where we don't know what will happen with the climate, but there's going to be a lot of change and a lot of turbulence. So this is a sort of cognitive dissonance. How do we get these two things connected? How do people think about their own children and think about everyone's children and the world that everyone's going to inherit in the long term? I know you've looked a lot. I remember in your book you say something about, you know, when people were building these large cathedrals, they could imagine the future of their children.
Yes.
And we're finding it hard, I think, to imagine the future for our grandchildren.
Yes, well, let me mention that paradox which I addressed, and I was speaking at York Minster just a week ago, so it's fresh in my mind. If we imagine the conditions of those who built these marvelous cathedrals, they were in a constricted world. They thought there might be an apocalypse within 1,000 years. Their lives were extremely hard, but nonetheless, they added bricks to this marvelous building, which wasn't finished until their grandchildren's lives, and which then inspires us a millennium later. And this is a contrast with us today, when we barely think 30 years ahead. But the reason why it's not quite such a paradox is that the medieval people, they may have had constricted horizons, but they thought that their children and grandchildren would live the same sort of lives as they did. So the grandchildren would appreciate the completed cathedral. Whereas now, I don't think we really know what the lives of people will be like 25 or 50 years ahead. And that's one inhibition in long-term planning. It's not the only excuse. We need to deal with climate change, even though we don't know what the conditions will be like. But I think that's a kind of excuse. And it's a matter of the appropriate discount rate in political decisions. And incidentally, on that front, there's only one context where we apply an essentially zero discount rate, and that's radioactive waste disposal, when the depositories are required to be safe for 10,000 or even 1,000,000 years. And that's slightly ironic when we can't plan energy supply even 30 years ahead.
So I'm going to go to everybody around the room in a minute. I'm going to just throw you in one last question, because in your book you talk about another type of risk, what you call truly existential risks. The word truly being there. And the ethical questions that such risks, that basically the complete wiping out of the human species, lots of other species as well. Do you want to just take us through because he didn't tell us the worst of it all, that's the trouble. So.
Well, just a word. I mean, as you'll have gathered, I think we will have a bumpy ride, and I expect societal disruptions to happen for all the reasons I mentioned. It's going to be very hard to avoid them, but I think it's most unlikely that we could wipe everyone out. But of course, philosophers do address that question. And there is an interesting philosophical issue here. David Parfit, the famous Oxford philosopher, talked about it most. And it's the following. If you imagine two scenarios, one wipes out 90% of humans, the other wipes out 100%. How much worse is that second one than the first? Well, you could say it's 10% worse. The body count's 10% higher. But you could also argue that it's almost infinitely worse, because if you wipe out everyone, then you destroy the potentiality of all future generations. And I think this is a serious reason why, if there was something which would actually wipe everyone out, we should do our damnedest to prevent it and prioritize that even more than other disasters. But this is, for the moment, just a philosophical issue. I don't think we can imagine anything would wipe out absolutely everyone. But the sad thing that's happening is that so many things that were the province of academic philosophers are something which become practical ethics. I mean, the one thing I didn't mention was, will robots be conscious? If they become conscious, should we care about their feelings and worry if they're underemployed or bored? And if your brain's downloaded into a machine, then is it still you, etc.? These are things philosophers discuss, but we may have to worry about some of them. That's a long answer, but I think
No, that's great.
don't worry about
Don't
all
worry.
being wiped out.
Don't worry about the existential risks. So I'm opening up the floor now. There are people with microphones who can take your questions.
Yes.
If you just raise your hand, I'll try to see you.
Yeah.
If I don't recognize you, jump up and down, and I hope I will be able to then. So who would like to start? And if there are any young people in the room who are worrying about the future, now's your time to take the floor and speak. So, oh, please, Robin, thank you.
Definitely don't count as young.
Young man.
But I'll jump in. Lord Rees, to take you to one of the big themes of today, which you would have picked up a bit this morning, this competition between China and the United States, which extends into the scientific sphere. The United Kingdom has invested a huge amount in its university sector, attracting brilliant students from all over the world, including from China. As you look to the future, do you see the risks of this kind of competition we're seeing really penetrating into your world, the scientific world? Can you sense that already? Or do you think in a way scientists will find some way to obviate, change, avoid your community being dragged into this same conflict?
Yes. Well, I'd like to say that Chinese science is really excellent now. People sometimes say it's just imitative, like they used to say about Japan, but they're really investing hugely, especially in AI and genetics, and they will become world leaders probably. And of course, science, as I said, is an international enterprise, and we benefit from having huge numbers of Chinese students and academic partnerships, and I hope we can keep it that way. That there are certain tensions. We know in the US they're reluctant to let in Chinese scientists, but I think we should do all we can to keep openness and ensure that these big challenges, climate, environment, avoiding pandemics, etc., can be tackled globally with China as well. I mean, their social system may be different. As I said, they could have a fully planned economy with AI and all that. But in science, I hope we can be international. And to be slightly more political, I worry more about Britain being perceived as a less attractive destination if we are isolated on the fringes of Europe. And we've got to make sure that Europe as a whole is an intellectual power as well as a political power to match the United States and China.
Please.
Thank you. You just began to answer the question I'm about to ask, which is, if you had to tell us the 2 or 3 things which, from any perspective, geopolitical, scientific, moral, philosophical, are the 2 or 3 things we ought to do to save ourselves, what would they be?
Well, I think obviously to cope with obvious environmental potential catastrophes, climate change. But I do worry very much about inequalities not only within nations, but between different continents. Any disaster in one continent will spread globally. Some of you may know a book by Jared Darman when he talks about collapse in some areas. Any collapse in one area will cascade globally. And I'm hesitant because there are some people from Africa here who know far more than me, but it seems to me that if Africa doesn't escape the poverty trap and has a huge population, then we are going to have very severe problems, mass migration, unless we really help them to catch up with us, because people are traveling more, they can travel, they know on the internet exactly what they're missing, and I think we need to do all we can to ensure that the lives of people in these other countries don't differ too much from those we're fortunate to enjoy here. If we don't do that, I'd be very pessimistic.
I have perhaps a slightly odd question. I've been wondering whether or not, even the past scientists like yourself, like, I don't know how you work actually, in a lab or something, but nowadays if you think about artificial intelligence, it is not just about brilliant people. It's also about brilliant equipment, but also more importantly, loads and loads of data. And that's where sort of size becomes really important. I just wonder whether or not that actually changes the way we understand science and progress. And other factors may become more important looking to the future, partly building on what Robin said about China and others.
Well, as I said, science alone is not enough. I mean, it's got to be guided by knowledge and wisdom, essentially. But I think regarding the understanding of science, I think since so many of the decisions politicians have to make have a scientific dimension, be it on energy, health, the environment, then everyone has to understand a bit so that the debate doesn't stay at slogan level. So we need to do that. And of course, I think the internet is a wonderful aid to this. Certainly it's leveled the playing field between scientists in different parts of the world. They all get information instantly. They don't have to wait for things to come by mail as we did when I was a student. Sorry?
The volume of data.
Well, the volume of data, that's a problem. But again, computers are able to cope with that. But the main point is that there's no reason why people in all parts of the world shouldn't be able to get access to that data.
Great. So, there's the microphone. Okay. Can we bring it over to this table, please? Thank you. Oh, great. Thanks.
Martin, I'm trying hard to find reasons why we shouldn't feel too guilty that we're handing on a certain sort of world to our children, because after all, when has there been a state of the world that is better off materially, has better medicine, has better comforts, has better opportunities, has better communication, and one other extremely important thing, every previous generation has handed on to their children the state of war. And we're not yet in a state of war and can avoid it. So I think we can talk ourselves up a little bit better than that. But in order to avoid the worst possible disaster, which is big power conflict leading to a great new conflagration, which could be existential, can AI come into this? After all, we program AI and we program it to do things better than we can do things ourselves. Can that not apply in the end to better management of cooperative security?
Well, certainly AI can manage a big network, traffic or electric grids better than humans. But of course, the way the instructions you give it are what determines what it does. And we've got to make sure it's given instructions which we believe are ethically appropriate. And one of the big problems is to ensure that an AI does have enough sort of common sense not to pursue a goal even when it's irrational and it's doing things. I mean, the simple example is, if you have a robot in the house and which is supposed to be helping you and it's run out of meat, it'll put the cat in the oven, thinking that's the right thing to do. You've got to make sure that robots have common sense. That's a small scale, but on a global scale as well. And it's not at all clear whether they will create new risks or actually help. But I think going back to how we should feel about future generations, it's true we're not leaving a war, but I think we are leaving a great deal more problems. And I worry that whereas, here we're enjoying the heritage of Victorians in this building, aren't we? And the question is, will we have left a heritage for future generations that matches what we have inherited from earlier generations and earlier centuries? I worry about that. And I think we need to have inspirational people. And I quoted David Attenborough and the Pope. And there's a nice quote from the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who said, it takes only a few determined people to change the world. Indeed, nothing else ever has. And if you think of abolishing slavery, civil rights, gay rights, etc., that's what's happened. A few charismatic people build public support, and then the politicians take it on. And the thing is, we don't yet have the right people who've done this. And I think if we don't have that, then I think ethically our society is failing, because if I go back to medieval times, things were pretty miserable then. but there wasn't much they could have done about it. Now, of course, we're better off on average than people were in medieval times, but the gap between the way we are and the way we could be is, I think, wider. And that's why I would contest those who claim that there's been ethical progress.
So, Martin, one of the things that, are you? One of the things, I was just going to say, one of the things that we've been grappling with is the issue of ethics and AI and the speed of decision making.
Yes.
Whereby, say, operators of weapon systems are having to rely on AI, but are then held responsible for the decision, even though they've had to rely on the machine. I mean, do you think this is an issue which will be resolved? Is this something, can we get these machines essentially to think a bit more like the decisions we would make, like you said about putting the cat in the oven?
Well, I mean, as you know, there is discussion about autonomous weapons which could use face recognition to decide where to shoot you or not. And the question is that allowed? But of course, the other consequence of AI is that if there's a third world war, it'll be over in a day.
Right.
It all happens so quickly.
Well, are there any more questions? Please, over here. Thank you. It'll come.
Right.
Well, first of all, thank you, sir, for your insightful presentation. My question is very simple. Do you believe that technological evolution, modernization, AI and all this can change human nature?
Can change, sorry?
Human nature.
Human nature.
Yes. Well, I mean, I certainly think that we'll have the biological capacity to do that, and that's why I do worry about the ethical aspects of that, because at the moment, genetic modification can be used just for attributes that depend on a single gene, the Huntington disease and things like that. But within 50 years, two things will have happened. First, AI will allow us to analyze millions of genomes and find out which combination of genes is responsible for desirable qualities in human beings. And at the same time, it'll become possible to synthesize a genome with those qualities. So it'll be possible to actually have designer babies in the science fiction sense. And as I said, I hope that there are ethical constraints on this imposed by governments, because it would lead to a fundamental kind of inequality as well as all kinds of risks. And that's why I think the only people who we should hope do this are the crazy people out on Mars. Let them do this, but we should regulate it here. But the possibility that we can change human nature and human physique is certainly possible. Certainly, we should contemplate within this century.
Is it inevitable?
Is it well, I mean, again, I would have thought that it's probably undesirable given that we'd be inept in coping with it. It's desirable if we can simply eliminate certain kinds of diseases, but it'll be a very fundamental kind of inequality if the wealthy people can redesign themselves to have longer lifespans. And going back to Mr. Kurzweil, he thinks that eventually people can become immortal. But there are some more serious people who think about extending the human lifespan significantly. And of course, that will be a game changer, and again, a serious kind of inequality if that is a technique available only to a privileged minority. Plus also having effects on world population, family structure, and everything else if some people live to be 200.
I'm very aware of the time, but I've got two more people who want the floor, and then I will close. So at the back there, and then there. Thank you.
I'm curious about the sort of scale of
the... If you could be really quick, please.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the scale of the ethical change that we're talking about. Up until 50 to 100 years ago, most people on Earth were subsistence farmers, and now we're living in a world where industries rise and fall in 10 years, and people need to be completely retrained. And the idea that most people in the world were illiterate even 100 years ago implies a level of societal and ethical change that just seems orders of magnitude higher than anything our civilization has been able to do before. How do we deal with ethical and technological and sort of conceptual revolutions on that magnitude in that short space of time? It's a very simple question, sorry.
Yes.
Right,
Well,
let me just take the last question,
okay,
if you don't mind, Martin.
Slightly Slightly different. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was having one of these jolly conversations as well with an author I was interviewing, and we talked about the end of the species and such subjects. And she said to me when we were talking about climate, she said she was less worried about climate ending our species, but more about corruption. And she said that really today corruption's not about democracy versus non-democracy, but it's a system that converts everything into cash, which needs to keep growing, and which I genuinely, she says, think spells the end of the species. And we are sort of denuding the planet of its resources through this. This is not about tax havens, but it is about offshore practices, which we're all sort of complicit in as well. Your thoughts on that,
Yes.
Lord Rees?
Well, I just say I resonate very much with that sentiment, very much. But going to the gentleman here, I think it is something new when things change radically within a human working life. That's something which, as you say, didn't happen in the past. But I think we shouldn't be too sure it will happen, because it's true that mobile phones, for instance, is a technology which has transformed our life and society and gone global within about 10 years. That's amazing. But some things still change slowly. I mean, for instance, we're celebrating this year not just the 50th anniversary of men on the moon, and there's been no advance in that sort of technology, but it's also the 50th anniversary of the jumbo jet. And we still fly in the same way as we did 50 years ago. And so I think many technologies have this sort of sigmoid curve when they grow very rapidly and then level off. And I know those enthusiasts about AI don't think that's going to happen, but I think it may be that there will be a sort of reaction against these fast changes, which will mean that just as aviation changed very rapidly but then leveled off, that may be true for all these other technologies. So I don't think we can assume that everything is going to accelerate.
So Martin, to end, one happy thing. One good thing, one thing you can see coming that's going to make us all feel better when we leave the room.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that despite all we've said, if the average person in the sort of Rawlsian sense was to ask when you'd like to live and be born, they would say that the present era is best, because for the average person it's better. And of course, for people in science, then it's a time when we're learning to understand the world in an extraordinary way. And I think when the history of advancing ideas is written a century from now, what's happened in my subject in the last 40 years and in genetics will be among the most exciting chapters. And so I feel very fortunate to have had a part in that. But I think the important thing is that despite all these problems, this is probably on average the best time to be alive. But as I say, we shouldn't take any ethical credit for this, because the gap between the way things are and the way they could be is wider than ever.
So the answer is become a scientist. Are you listening, everyone? So thank you, Martin. That was absolutely brilliant. I think we should all go away and retrain as scientists.
Good.